Thank you, Lascan Corla. As we recover from the pandemic, this budget was an opportunity to improve quality of life by investing in our public services, housing, childcare, disability services, SNAs, fair climate action. These are issues people raise with all of us. We need substantial and sustained funding in our health, education and local services. In the limited time I have, I'll raise just some of the issues in this budget. Disability is a complex area. Government policy must reflect this in providing interventions where it is most required. I welcome the increase in the disability health budget, but it still falls so far short of the 350 million additional funding needed to address the unmet needs of people with disabilities as outlined in the Department's own disability capacity review. Announcing funding is one thing, but will it result in underground services? There are over 40 children waiting for initial contact with the West Cork Children's Disability Network. That's just one example. Local disability services all over the country are still at reduced capacity due to the staffing issues. Not to mention the employment rate for people with disabilities here is among the lowest in the EU. There is a pressing need for other interventions. People with disabilities experience poverty and social exclusion at much higher levels than the rest of the population. There is a very, very clear need for a cost of disability allowances that finally recognises that living with a disability is expensive. I welcome the long overdue support for carers. Family carers rightly feel they have been forgotten by government throughout the pandemic, given the contribution made by this group. It is beyond disappointing that there was no move on funding a dedicated long-term carers pension scheme. We must have a rights-based approach for people with disabilities, so when you qualify for a service, you get that service. The absence of this approach is evident in the shortage of SNAs. I more than welcome the funding to recruit more SNAs and special education teachers, but families and schools should have guarantees that there is an identified need for SNAs or resource hours. They will be provided. That isn't the case. There are several families and schools across West Cork I'm working with to secure more special education resources and additional ASD classes. It is evident there is a pressing need for a special education school in West Cork. Unbelievably, there just isn't one. People should have a right to education. This budget should and could have ensured this. It is simply not good enough that it didn't. Secondly, the lack of proper treatment of eating disorders is something I have repeatedly raised. There is only 3 inpatient beds in this country for eating disorders, and they are all in Dublin. The inclusion of additional funding for the National Clinical Programme is meaningless unless it is spent. None of the 1.6 million allocated in 2019 for this incredibly serious issues was spent. There is a very worrying trend. It was recently revealed that the 10 million allocated for pandemic-related mental health supports in February was also not spent. It's disgraceful enough that the government only allocates 5.1% of the health budget for mental health, when the World Health Organization recommends 12%, but to think that the Department and the HSE do not spend that allocated money is just shocking. The women's health investments, including funding to address maternity strategies, delivery of free contraception and sexual assault treatments units, amounts to only 31 million. I came to the very reluctant conclusion recently that the ongoing restrictions in maternity hospitals are because maternal health care is at the bottom of this government's priority list. This budget really just clarifies that. Figures on allocated money for National Maternity Strategy are wholly inadequate and only serve to inform us that this strategy won't be implemented anytime soon. Again, simply not good enough. Domestic violence is another area that needs to be mentioned. The only references to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in the expenditure report are in terms of justice. Funding for more Gardaí and awareness campaigns is of course important, but it is only one part of a very complex issue. An additional 338 emergency accommodation units are required to meet our obligations under the Istanbul Convention. This budget should have at least begun the process to meet these requirements, as well as increase funding for local support organisations. We provide half of the recommended bare minimum of refuge spaces for domestic violence. This budget won't change that, and it's not good enough. Finally, for agriculture, this budget is paying lip service to sustainability, but there is no reflection on the significant support needed to help farmers move to practices required to address the biodiversity crisis. The Irish Natura and Hill Farmers Association have rightly questioned the government's commitment to a just transition on climate change and biodiversity loss. We know farmers will have to do some of the heavy lifting to meet our emission reductions targets, and the government is obliged to support them. Instead, farmers are bearing the brunt of criticism for climate change when, in reality, this is the department's doing. We all know that all of our practices are guided directly by what the department funds. How is this not being addressed yesterday, for example? You know, improving tillage sector, we need more. Anyway, I don't have time. What is the department funding? The greyhound racing industry is receiving 17.6 million in the budget.
We're over time.
Just one last point, sorry, last Ceann Corla. For context, the Irish Guide Dogs for the Blind were allocated 886,000 and had to, that's in to give context of a previous budget, they had to raise 5 million themselves. Why aren't they getting a fraction of what the greyhound racing industry is getting?
Oireachtas.